Hello, everybody. Welcome to the session 10, Environmental Perspective on the Urban-Rural Nexus. On behalf of the German Environment Agency, I warmly welcome you to our session where we want at the urban-rural nexus from an environmental perspective. My name is Alice Schröder. I am working at the German Environment Agency, where I head the Department of Sustainable Spatial Development and Environmental Assessment. Firstly, I want to say that my colleagues from the UBA, the German Environment Agency, shortly UBA, that we are very proud to be chair of the conference, and in collaboration with renowned international partners, we prepared this session. And we are very happy to chair the session today and to have you all here. Let me also introduce my colleagues Daniel Reißmann and Karl Eckert, who are sitting next to me, and you will also see them in a minute. Daniel is sharing the session with me, and I will hand over to him. And Karl is supporting us to get in contact with you via the feed function. He will transfer your questions, remarks, and information into our session. Screen, you see now our agenda for the afternoon. There are 7 presentations in the 3 blocks we called environmental issues, mobility and logistics. And after the coffee break, we will look at functional relationships. And we will have a closed discussion as well. Daniel and I will give you a short introduction, and the following presentations take about 15 minutes each, and we will have 5 minutes for questions and remarks after every presentation. We plan to finish at 6:15, but we also have some time till the next. I encourage you to make intensive use of the chat function to give your feedback to the presentation, to share your information with us, to provide us with information. And you can find the chat on the right side in the MEA app, where you also find the wall of interest. Now I hand over to Daniel, who will start with our short introduction from the perspective of the
Yes, thank you very much, Alice. Also welcome everybody from my side. As Alice already mentioned, my name is Daniel Reißmann. I'm working also at the German Environment Agency. And now I will give you the first slides, introductory slides on our topic and environmental perspective on the urban-rural nexus, insight in an ongoing project on sustainable suburban partnerships. So as you all know, sustainable and rural resilient urban-rural partnerships are a pressing topic because of rapid urbanization challenges in cities and their surroundings, which are often connected with impacts on the environment. At the same time, cities and their surrounding areas are essential actors for transformation processes towards more sustainability. And so we will present now an approach at UBA how we will strategically consider these topics in our current research agenda and also with an ongoing project where we look at environmental friendly development of suburban areas. Please. Sorry, it does not work that we can switch to the next slide. So we have to wait a minute. However, also without a slide, I can tell you something about this topic in our agency. Now the presentation is not there anymore. So there's the slide. Okay, great. So let me start with our strategic research agenda at the UBA, which is named Urban Environmental Protection. We published this agenda in 2018. And as you see there, we identified 3 topic clusters, we named this, which are focus issues for us in the agency for a research action in the next 3 to 5 years. And one of our cross-sectional topics were the urban-rural relationships that we identified at important issue for the upcoming years in our research regarding urban environmental protection. And many impacts of urbanization on the environment cannot probably discuss without considering urban-rural relationships. And you can see this on the right figure there. There are many connections between urban and rural or suburban areas. And for instance, material flows or also traffic, especially commuter traffic. Also, land take for settlement is a suburban issue. As you know, maybe when you're from Germany, you know we have a goal in our sustainability strategy to reduce land take to less than 30 hectares per day, and we will not reach this. And it's also a suburban problem because settlement development especially takes place in suburban areas. So, and now I will hand over to Alice with, will introduce you to the next slides.
So I have to go to the next slide. It's not so easy at the moment, but we will. In the next minutes, I want to point out some issues gathered from an ongoing project at the Department for Transport, Noise and Spatial Development at UBA on sustainable urban-rural partnerships. That project is currently a work in progress, so I will concentrate on the questions we try to answer and on our approach to answer these questions. As Daniel said, rural, suburban, and urban areas are often spatially, administratively, and functionally closely interwoven. Being able to live sustainably and in a mobile manner is often determined by the use of land and other natural resources in an urban-rural context and the associated negative environmental consequences. The focus of our analysis as German Environment Agency, Department for Transport, Noise and Sustainable Spatial Development, concentrates on the following 4 fields of demand you see on the slide: living, mobility, leisure and recreation, and working. Regarding living, we asked the question, how can the development of residential areas be sustainably managed for the varying demands found in a city and its surrounding areas, and at the same time reduce the consumption of land, the land take? Regarding mobility, we want to look in an urban-rural context, how can we achieve an ecological transformation of mobility in cities as well as in their surrounding areas? Regarding leisure and recreation, we want to answer the question how we can secure open space in as well as in the surrounding areas, not only for the continued future use, but also how can we qualify them for the various ecosystem functions? What requirements are to be set for the improvement of the quality of the open spaces in areas surrounding cities? And finally, we look at the field of demand of working, where we look how can modern working forms be realized in order to enhance the potentials for environmental protection and contribute to socially and ecological sustainable city-rural relationships. The project cross-cutting issues you can find on the right side. The thematic background of our topic focuses on the special characteristics of a city's rural surroundings with its specific environmental functions, strengths, and weaknesses. I brought some pictures to illustrate that. On the one hand, the surrounding areas of cities fulfill a variety of functions for the core city, such as relieving strained inner city housing markets, and they are offering spaces for business expansion. They are facilitating traffic routes, providing green infrastructure with all its ecosystem services. Last but not least, the areas surrounding cities are often attractive places for people to live. On the other hand, the surrounding rural urban areas are facing enormous challenges and transformation processes. Examples include well-known drivers such as suburbanization, the divergence of residence and workplace, as well as traffic and spatial structure, which favor motorized individual traffic. Further drivers of change are dynamic trends and changes in leisure and recreation, as well as digitization. The corona pandemic has already shown some emerging changes in the relationships between urban and surrounding rural areas. For example, new forms of work, which have the potential to maybe reduce commuter trips. There will be a presentation looking at this later on. Here you have again the negative environmental impacts related to those central drivers and trends. The results of our project will be presented in November next year at the 3rd Uber Forum Mobile and Sustainable. That forum established central conference platform for discussing important environmental issues in the context of sustainable mobility and spatial development. For example, you see in 2017, we presented a vision for the city of tomorrow, and in 2019, a vision with goals and targets for the air traffic of the future. Our aim is to present and discuss models and recommendations for an environmentally friendly design of rural urban surroundings. We want to initiate a debate with politicians, civil society, science, of course, and the public at federal, regional, and municipal levels about what the mentioned trends mean from the perspective of environmental protection, how we can strengthen the qualities of the surrounding rural urban areas, and effectively reduce negative impacts on the environment. For now, I would like to finish our short introduction. We don't have time for discussion now, but in the end of our session, we will have some time to discuss especially our guiding questions regarding the fields of demand, living, mobility, leisure, recreation, and working, and also our first ideas for a better integration of those fields. Let me now introduce our first speaker. Please welcome with me Dritan Ustia from the University of Schröder in Albania. Dritan is a lecturer and researcher of geography affiliated to the University of Schröder in Albania. His main research interests includes urbanization, urban and rural development, especially peri-urbanization processes in post-socialist Albania. In 2014, he obtained his PhD at the University of Tirana with a thesis related to the peri-urban area of Schröder city and its transformation after the changes of 1990, which is also the topic of his presentation today. Dritan, we are very happy to have you here and to get an insight into rural urban issues in Albania. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Elise. Greetings to everybody. And I'm very pleased to be here in this conference. And I'm trying to share my presentation. Okay, well, I think everything is okay, yes? Okay, so the title of my presentation, as introduced, is Environmental Issues and Perspective on the Urban-Rural Nexus of a Post-Socialist City. And I have taken into consideration the case of the municipality of Schröder in Albania. Actually, it will be a perspective, I think, from the one that you might experience in European Union or in Germany. The paper takes into consideration the peripheral or the urban peripheries and their development processes in post-socialist countries like Albania. After 1990, when a new political and economic system was introduced, Albania experienced one of the most striking internal migrations in the history of modern Europe. for sure, when we say that we have into consideration its small size, let's say, and also population. And this phenomenon lies at the center of the main environmental and socio-economic changes that the country has experienced during this period. And more than everywhere else, these development processes were experienced in the outskirts of the largest Albanian cities, in their urban-rural nexus, or the so-called peri-urban areas, as I have called them also in my PhD dissertation. This presentation is mainly focused on the spatial transformations that occurred in the peri-urban area of Schröder city, and especially the environmental and infrastructural issues that it has experienced, and where do they stay, and what can be done for the future. And for the purpose of the study, the urban-rural nexus of the municipality of Schröder has been identified with Rathinat administrative unit. We have a map here of this area. This is an area that was previously a rural area, but that now is part of the larger municipality of Schröder since 2015, when Albania had its a new land and administrative reform. So in the map here, we can see the location of the region of Schröder in the northwestern Albania, close to Montenegro. And this is the new municipality of Schröder with all its new administrative areas. And here we have the peri-urban area of Schröder city, the Rathinat administrative unit that lies on the periphery of the city of Schröder, that actually is also the center of this new municipality. So, data and basic information about this area. So its surface area. Now that we have we know about where it's located, its surface. We are talking about a small area. The surface, its surface area is about 47 square kilometers, and according to the official data, the population is about 25,000 inhabitants. But as we also transformations that the area has experienced after the 90s, in demographic terms, we can say that actually the population doubled in this area. We have also a graph that shows the increase of population along the years, especially after the 90s. And in 1990, the number of population in this area was about 11,000, while in 2015, as we said, about 25,000 officially, but it is estimated that actually more than 30,000 people live here. And the main reason of population in this area is related to internal migration. The migration of population from the rural and mountainous areas of Schröder region toward the city of Schröder, actually, but as it was more difficult for these people to settle inside the urban area of the city of Schröder, they found more opportunities and more free land and more space outside the periphery in the urban area of the city of Schröder, in the Rathinat administrative unit, in this urban-rural nexus of the city municipality of Schröder that I'm talking about. So that's the reason why most of the people in this area. And besides the demographic transformations, we just shortly have introduced here some economic transformations that the area experienced after the 90s, like the decreasing role and importance of agriculture. That, as I said, the area was previously a rural area and agriculture was its main economic activity. We have also signs of development of peri-urban type of agriculture, which is something new for rural, let's say, areas, previously rural areas of Albania. We have an increased importance of agro-industrial activities, the constant growth of the service sector, which is something new that was introduced after the 90s, especially small-scale retailing, and the informal development patterns in this respect, as also demographically, economically, and we will see that Albania continues to have these problems with informality in many areas, and the diversification of economic activities in general. Much evident were the land use and environmental changes and the area experienced after the 90s. And more than everything, perhaps, regarding this, we can talk about this map, which is a comparison map of the use of land in the area between 1985 and 2013. The situation should be more of the same even today. So for the creation of the map, the land use map of 1985, I have used a topographic map of the time. And for the creation of the map of land use map of 2013, I have used the satellite data that I had in this position, an orthophoto map that was used for legalization process in this area, and also the data from the field data from the area where I actually do live in here. And if in this map, what we can see that which is the most important change of the transformation is the spreading of the residential areas, which are shown in red in the map. You can see their spreading and the growth of settlements from the 1985 to 2013. This happened, of course, as a result mainly of this internal migration and informal urban development. So we can say that we have more than 4,000 new settlements that were created after the 90s, informal settlements in this area. And most of them were created, actually, the people settled, and these residential areas were created, and mostly in the previously agricultural land. So these land use transformations show us about generally about the transformation that the area has experienced after the 90s. All these informal days are ongoing in the process of recognizing the informal settlements in Albania that is going on since 2006. We have a photo in here. I have taken all the photos here just recently, some days ago, and that shows the new areas that were created after the 90s. I have, we can say they are informal in the way that they are, most of them are not yet legalized, let's say, but you can see that the quality of the building is generally good, even though the infrastructure lacks, let's say, there are for sure many needs to improve infrastructure in these areas, informal areas. So now let's focus more on the topic of the presentation, the infrastructural environmental problems of this area. As a result of all the above-mentioned transformations, the peri-urban area of Schröder city is currently facing several infrastructural problems, and the lack of an adequate water supply system, the deficiencies in the supply system, insufficient educational, health, and social infrastructure in general, needs for improvement regarding the road transportation system. I have to say, since I told also Elise introduced that I have been studying this area from many years, let's say, not just even previously before my PhD that I completed in 2014. I have to say that the situation regarding infrastructure and also environmental problems has generally been improving, but very slowly, let's say. So there are still problems need to be addressed, and the photo see some of these infrastructural problems that are shown, like the say here we have a bridge that needs to be reconstructed for sure over Kiri River. Here is the existing railway that connects Tirana with Montenegro along and that passes through this area that for sure now is used just for merchandise, let's say, transportation, and the road network system that needs improving. There have been some kinds of investments in this regard, but problems continue to exist. Meanwhile, by analyzing the data in this position and also by using fieldwork, some of the findings suggest that the main environmental issues that are experienced in this area during this period are mentioned below, like the unsustainable use of natural resources, the increased rate of water, land, and air pollution, the mismanagement of urban waste, the increased scale of erosion, especially along the shores of the lake and along the shores of the rivers, the activation of flood hazards, the increased rate of deforestation. There's still a small forested area close to the lake of Schröder, and when we can see this issue, and the fragmentation and tendencies of land and tendencies of desertification of agriculture. Also here, there are some photos that I have taken just recently, some days ago, that shows the problems with urban waste mismanagement in general and flood hazard reactivation. So we can say that regarding the urban waste management in this area, in this urban-rural nexus, close to the city of Schröder, we can say that there are some improvements, as I told, since 2015, when the area became part of the larger municipality of Schröder, but the problems do exist. if we find, let's say, an improvement of the situation along the main axis of transportation and close to the city, if we go further in the areas, let's say, that are not very much seen by the people, we can see that the problems continue to exist, and especially will the solid waste management, which is a very important. As the conclusions and recommendations in my last slide, I can say as recommendations regarding improvement of infrastructure and the quality of environment in this area. I think, in my opinion, that it should focus in these main directions: the densification of the existing urban areas. I see this as an important let's say, suggestion to conserve and protect the remaining natural and agricultural land in the area. So I think that one of the most important issues in this area right now, we can say that the migration of population toward this area somehow continues, even though it has slowed down recently during the last years, let's say, but it continues. And one of the main issues with this area would be to protect what has been remained regarding the natural landscape and the agricultural land. In this context, I suggest that the densification of the existing urban areas will be the main suggestion to give. Also, there's a need to improve and to better integrate the road network system of this area of the urban nexus with the neighboring administrative units, and especially with the city of Schröder, and the revitalization of Tirana-Schröder honey-coated railway that I previously showed would be another important suggestion to connect also area and to give it an impact in the economic development. The connection of its main settlements with the water supply network of the city of Schröder, one of the main problems that this urban-rural nexus experiences today and the settlements is the supply with water supply. Say it's still a problem that has not been resolved even after 30 years, let's say, of democracy during after the 90s. Also, even though the energy supply system has been improving, there are still issues in this respect, and there are also space for improvement. For sure, it's another urgent issue for this area that needs to be addressed is the establishment of a wastewater sewage system, which lacks. Actually, it totally lacks, and just what people privately, let's say, do on their own, but something that is managed by the government is lacking. Something bigger, let's say, public. And at the last, the drafting implementation of an efficient urban waste management plan based on the best European Union practices. We saw that there are a lot of issues with urban waste management in this area. Even though there are some small improvements, the problems do exist. As a final conclusion, I could say that the main problem for urban areas in Albania, huge to finalize their ongoing process of legalization, a process that has begun since 2006, as I said, but that still is continuing, and it's actually continuing quite slowly, so it will take some time. There are regarding land tenure and ownership, which is another important issue with the peri-urban settlements and informal settlements in Albania after the 90s. And of course, also what would help in this respect for all these problems would be the development and implementation of land use and spatial planning. There are some initiatives in this respect. So regarding, by example, the municipality of Schröder, where this urban-rural nexus now is part of it, there is an development of this land use planning, let's say, and the improvement in 2016, but we have problems with implementation. Thank you. Danke. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dritan, for that very interesting presentation and the insight into Albanian suburban development in the last 30 years. We have 2 minutes for questions. Carl, I look to you and ask you, is there any new information from the chat, remarks or questions?
So looking at the chat right now, there are no questions. I'm sure they will come in as we progress. Remember, we have a slight time lag, so the participants are seeing this 30 seconds later. I would suggest that when the questions come in, we come back to it at a later point.
Yes, very good suggestion. Tritan, you mentioned in the end the role of spatial planning, and it was really impressive to learn about the enormous internal migration from rural to urban areas after 1990, and which led to informal settlements with all negative environmental impacts. Did cities and regions learn from that period, and do you have a kind of planning system at different spatial levels in place right now?
I talked just shortly in the last slide of my presentation. So these peri-urban area that I talked about, that I have taken into consideration, since 2015, now is part of the larger municipality of Schröder, which the center of which is the city of Schröder itself. When this new administrative and territorial reform was introduced, one of the main urgent needs was to also develop land use and spatial planning. So there is, yes, there are in place, there are some practices and some laws for sure. There is an improvement of the land use planning plan of this area, of this municipality of Schröder in 2016 or 17. I'm not sure, it has been approved. And now it needs to be, let's say, implemented. And one of the main problems that we have, as I previously mentioned, is the implementation of our laws, let's say. And especially a big problem regarding the implementation of spatial planning in Albania, especially in these peri-urban areas, in these urban-rural nexuses of the largest cities of Albania, like Tirana for sure, which has experienced the most dramatic changes in this respect, Durrës, Bashkode also, and the other cities, is also entitling and land ownership. Because in Albania, we have not yet resolved this problem of land entitling, land ownership.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Tritan. I think there is some new information from the chat. Maybe, Carl, you can bring this into our session.
Yes, gladly, exactly. There was one question from the chat from Mr. Tobias Henning. First of all, saying thank you very much for the interesting presentation. And I think you just mentioned it in your answer right now, but if you can again stress what are the main hurdles for implementation. You mentioned land ownership, were there maybe some others as well, which you can mention in addition?
That the main reason would, the main problem would be land and land entitling ownership. We still are undergoing this process in Albania, and but also not just for land use planning, but in general in Albania we have with the problem of implementation of laws, of enforcement of law, let's say. So I think that this would be the main, let's say, the main urgent issue to be resolved, but it will take some time, land entitling. But also, I would say, perhaps also a better connection, let's say, of hierarchies between the central planning structures, organizations, and the local ones, authorities. That would help in this respect, a better connection or, let's say, communication between them. But also a lack of, I would say there's also a lack somehow of experience and in this regard, because we have just, let's say, 30 years of experience after the democracy and we don't have much experience in land use planning and spatial planning in Albania. So we are in the first steps. It will take some time, but hopefully we will get there slowly.
Okay, thank you very much also for this information. Since we have a quite tight schedule, I would like to hand over to Daniel, who will introduce our next speaker. Thank you very much again, Tritan.
Yes, thank you. I now will introduce our next speaker, Dr. Marianne Sanderson. Marianne is an environmental economist and senior researcher at Aarhus University in Denmark, and she's also part of the European Topic Center for Climate Change Impacts, Vulnerability and Adaptation, complicated words, supporting the EEA in producing a recently published report on urban adaptation in Europe on climate change, and she will present this to us now. And Marianne is also the coordinator of the EU-funded Horizon 2020 project ReGreen, and she focuses especially on environmental and behavioral economics and the field of urban and peri-urban system, nature-based solution, climate change, and ecosystem managing across different habitats. So, Marianne, the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. This is a presentation that I've made together with the European Environment Agency lead author on this Urban Adaptation in Europe report, Alexander Kazmierka, and Margareta Breil from CMCC, and this is really on behalf of the whole team at this ETC-CCA. It's a very rich report, and I haven't been in on every aspect, but I hope that you'll find it interesting. See if I can get this to... Yes, it works. So just to start, this is the report, and below you'll see the link. It's freely available and downloadable. Some of the key findings before I move on to the rural-urban nexus particularly is really that climate change is our reality and the development is not in our sense of direction. So that means that there's an urgent need to adapt to climate impacts in cities and towns. And the reason for that is really that we are the most urbanized continent in the world, and the trend is increasing. Today, 75% of Europeans live in urban and peri-urban areas. And these cities are really economic hubs, which means that they also have a lot of economic assets and infrastructure at stake. But they also are very important parts of many different parts of population live in cities. And the social and physical characteristics in cities actually exacerbate the climate impacts. If we look at, and the report does that at length, and I'll not dwell on that in the presentation later, but just to put the stage here, that in terms of adaptation, Europe is still in the very early stages. There's slow progress in adaptation planning. There's few material measures taken. It's predominantly soft measures of planning and informing people of risks, for instance, in heat or flooding. There's a general very serious underinsurance in terms of when damage occurs, for instance, from flooding. The majority of our private assets are not insured. So there's generally an insufficient human and financial resources available for adaptation in Europe. But on the positive note, there's really an increasing commitment of local authorities to do adaptation. So now in the next part of the presentation, I'll be talking about the urban-rural nexus, because it's really characterized by both dependencies and competition. And here I'll take, of course, there's many more climate impacts happening in cities, but I focus here on what is unique to the urban-rural nexus and how they actually exacerbate that connection between the urban and rural areas. So if we look at the risk of pluvial and river flooding in cities, then from the urban perspective, what exacerbates the flood risk is really that we've tended over a century and even more today to urbanize in floodplains. So the risk of flooding is much higher here, but also because of the soil sealing, the impervious surfaces in cities that increase the runoff, and that exacerbates the river flow, the stream flows, but also in terms of the water quality. And that's also because of containment in rivers, linking back to urbanization of floodplains, but constructing on the riverbed so that we can be closer to the water, and the need for space is very high in urban areas. So that's, of course, a very logical reaction for that. But from the rural origin, there's generally a lack of appropriate river basin management upstream because of intensive land uses. Also, the rivers and streams have been constrained. And there's also a general drainage of agriculture and of forest for production purposes that exacerbates the runoff to rivers and streams. But also soil sealing in rural areas has an impact on this. So that was on the flooding risks and how the urban-rural nexus exacerbates those hazards. If we look at the coastal flooding and coastal erosion, in terms of the urban origins here is the increasing urbanization of coastlines. Traditionally, our urban centers have been focused close to water, coast or rivers, but that really has led to a destruction of natural protection structures. And in terms of the rural origin, the intensification of agriculture and the removal of natural buffer and protection structures also alleviate or enhance the risks of coastal flooding. In terms of droughts and water scarcity, another very important part, especially in the southern parts of Europe, but not uniquely, it's the high levels of abstraction for public water supply, tourism, industrial cooling purposes. And from the rural side, it's really a high demand for irrigation of agriculture that is governed in many different ways. But even in the southern parts of Europe, the demand of cities kind of overrule the demand from agriculture, but the demand from agriculture is at the same time very high. In terms of wildfires, the increasing wildland-urban interface called WUI is something that really leads to the increased observation of large wildfires and also the probability of that in future. And that really depends on the development of second homes in wildland areas, urban sprawl. And from the rural side, that's really a socioeconomic development over the years that have led to a depopulation of rural areas. And that means that the land is not managed in the same way, and that leads to a higher fuel load, so that when the conditions for wildfires occur, there's more to burn. And so that is also linked to a lack of landscape management. Finally, as the last one is the high temperatures, and that is really something unique to urban areas. And I've included it here because it's really as a contrast to the rural areas. So we have the urban heat island effect that makes living in cities less attractive compared to rural areas. And that is also down to densifying of cities and also sprawling of urban areas into rural areas, and that magnifies the impacts of increasing heat. So the climate goes in one direction, increasing temperatures, but how we organize our cities exacerbates this trend. So the challenge is really here to reintroduce what I could call the rural features of vegetation and water into urban morphology. And now in the next part of the presentation, I'll give some maps and explanations of what it looks like across Europe. And this is the first one on urban heat island. And science shows that cities across Europe may have twice as many heat wave days as rural surroundings. And that's really caused by the heat capacity of cities. So it sucks in the heat during day and releases it during nighttime. It can also be the heat sources and impervious urban surfaces. So it happens both in winter time and in summertime, but the serious problems for human health is really in summer periods. And this urban heat island is particularly in parts of Europe projected to experience dramatic increase in number of extreme heat waves, and that's particularly in southeastern Europe, also Albania down here. So the map shows, the color shows the projected number of extreme heat waves from a period today until the 50s. under a high emission scenario, RCP 8.5 it's called. So a projected number of more than 6 is really down here in eastern part, southeastern part of Europe. But we also see a north-south disparity in access to public green areas. I haven't included that here, but you can find it in the report, a very nice distribution of how much green area do people in cities across Europe have access to. And it shows that towards the south of Europe, people have less access to green areas that can actually alleviate urban heat island effect. But that's also the areas where those trends will be much stronger. And here we have an example from Belgium in Antwerp, where the city of Antwerp in Belgium has investigated the impact of urban heat island in the center of Antwerp. And so this is, in their studies, they found that the number of heat wave days in the city will rise twice as fast as in rural surroundings. And this shows that you can see the different colors of temperature from maximum wet bulb globe temperature is the measurement of 22 degrees up to 28 degrees. And you should notice those above 28 degrees is what is causing heat stress in the human body. So you also see that the location with trees or water surfaces are the coolest, whereas paved squares and streets with no shade show the highest heat stress. And the adaptation aspects that Antwerp is working on is on the regulation side to introduce more green roofs, permeable and green parking lots, increase the albedo of buildings, but also to install fountains, ponds, trees, parks and green areas to improve the thermal comfort of people. And especially not least the heat forecast and warning system, which our report also finds is one of the most efficient adaptation measures. Now I'd go on to the next, which is pluvial and river flooding. And here again, there's a strong north-side divide in projected changes in 1 in 10-year high river flow events. So the annual average precipitation is projected to increase in Northern Europe and decrease in Southern Europe. But the heavy precipitation events are projected to increase over most of Europe. So this map shows a low impact and high impact scenario with a ratio of river flows from 2050 to 2100, so mid-century to end of century, compared to mid last century and beginning of this century. So anything above above 1, means that there's an increase in the impact of pluvial and river flooding. And you can see here on the map that it's really in the northwestern part of the Atlantic that will have some severe impacts on that. And the problems about this rural urban nexus is really the construction on floodplains and the associated risks. And this is an overview of the amount of constructions in floodplains in the countries across Europe. And you should notice the dark red, light red colors, which is the urban, fabric and industrial commercial transport. And you can see it moves around almost over half, for instance, in Switzerland, of floodplains are actually being built on. In Luxembourg, it's quite bad too, up in Austria, and Belgium up here, it's quite high as well. So it really shows that there's a short-term interest that outweigh longer-term flood risk management interest. And we also see that a lot of our critical infrastructure is located in floodplains like hospitals. And at the same time, they provide an important water storage function. So there's really a clash, a competition for space here. And we also find that only 28% of insured losses are caused by hydrological events, predominantly river flooding. So that's far more that is uninsured. Now, I would like to move to the risk of wildfires, which is particularly high in the Mediterranean. So what I talked about before is the wildland, sorry, it's written wrong, wildland-urban interface. So that's the interfaces between the built environment and forests or other vegetation types with accumulated biomass. And this map shows the distribution of wildland-urban interface per unit land area across Europe. And it really shows that there's a high WUI distribution in Central Europe, Western Germany, Eastern France, Belgium, Switzerland, where they have more than 10% of WUI per unit land area. But also it's found in Scandinavia, around the big cities of Oslo in Norway, Göteborg and Stockholm in Sweden, and Helsinki in Finland. But generally, you could also argue that these problems of wildland-urban interface are extended across Europe. And this is another map.
Marianne, sorry, we are a little bit running out of time. So can you please hurry up a little bit? Thank you.
Yeah. This is a map that shows the link between large fires and urban areas. So that shows that that problem is predominantly in the southern part of Europe. And here there's a forecast, if we take the high-end emissions, of the risk of wildfires in Europe. Coming to the conclusion is really that many climate hazards cross city boundaries, and cities and rural areas also may compete for resources like scarce water resources and land use. So that really calls for an interaction between urban and rural areas, so multi-level governance and policies that recognize the role of rural areas for increasing urban resilience. We also find that there's an absence of monitoring evaluation of adaptation actions, and that's really needed in order to be efficient in dealing with climate change. And generally, all these hazards are not new, but the intensity and frequency will change, which necessitates new approaches to risk management. And finally, the unsustainable urban developments magnifies current and projected climate impacts. So there's an urgent need to change the way in which we plan and construct cities. And especially that adaptation needs to be considered as an essential aspect of sustainable urban development. So thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Marianne, and sorry for interrupting you, but our time frame is very, very tight. So, okay, I've already asked Carl if we have some questions from the audience, but this is not the case yet, I think. So then I will ask a question from my side. So you named important climate hazards to urban and rural areas and conclude that it would be sensible that there must be a stronger interaction between these areas regarding climate adaptation in future. So are there any specific actions or plans regarding the urban-rural interaction regarding climate adaptation? So are there some concrete plans? Do you know what I mean? Some regional approaches or something like? Is there something in discussion? You have to unmute.
Thank you. Well, oftentimes these cities also have the peri-urban areas, and it necessitates a regional approach. And so there's a requirement for municipalities, for instance, in Denmark, that they all should do climate adaptation plans. And there's a European climate adaptation strategy under revision that's coming out soon. And there also the peri-urban, urban aspects will be very much important, and especially these nature-based solutions will be put to the forefront, and they need to look at the landscape level and not look at the various isolated land uses. So yes, and there's a lot of integrated projects that takes the landscape regional perspectives in terms of hazards and disaster risk reduction, but reality is always a bit slower than policy strategies, research areas, and the reality is that in many places developments are slow, it's not really being implemented, it's not being monitored what is implemented, so we don't have a lot of evidence on what is the effectiveness of the different measures. We know in general, but it's all very local. So there's a much more research and monitoring that needs to take place, but I would argue also that municipalities will need to take action even if they don't know everything now.
Yeah, that's a good message. That's right. So, okay, I think there are not other questions. Okay, so I will hand over to Elise, which will introduce the next speaker.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also from my side, we come now to our second block in our afternoon session. The next two presentations will closer look at mobility and logistics. And I'm very happy to introduce the next speaker. I'm very happy to introduce Holger Heinfellner to you. Holger Heinfellner works at the Austrian Environment Agency, and he's a trained environmental technician with a focus on landscape, traffic, and infrastructure planning. He has been working as a mobility expert at the Austrian Environment Agency since 2014, and since 2019, he has been head of the expert team on mobility and noise. He deals with various aspects of the mobility transition and decarbonization approaches to reach the climate and energy targets. And his fields of work include active mobility, electromobility, emission modeling, and data analysis, as well as the development of mobility-related measures and scenarios. Holger, we are very interested in your presentation about the potential and effects of virtual mobility. The screen is yours. Please unmute. Holger, you have to unmute.
Yes, I'm here now. I'll just show my slides again. Yeah, so good afternoon. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Yeah, I'm excited for the possibility to tell you about our research project potentials and effects of virtual mobility. I would like to start with a short introduction. Greenhouse gas emissions from transport sector are one of the biggest challenges in Austria as regards tackling climate change. In 2019, we recorded an increase in greenhouse gas emissions for the 5th time in a row. In 2019, already almost reaching the all-time high of 2005 again. On the other hand, we have very ambitious national and international climate targets to reach. Above all of them, in Austria, it's the carbon neutrality already in the year 2040, which is written down in the actual governmental program. And to reach this goal, obviously, a sustainable trend reversal needs to be achieved. And therefore, to reach this ambitious goal, it won't be enough to simply put 100% of our energy on technology. It won't be enough to simply switch from one car, from a conventional car, to, for example, a fully electric car. But it will be absolutely necessary also to reduce the general activity, to reduce the overall traffic volume. And in this context, we asked ourselves about the potential contribution of virtual mobility. We worked on our project. We have been working on our project since July 2019, together with a mobility research company from Austria, also called MICA. The project was funded by the Federal Ministry of Austria for Climate Action, and it was accompanied by a very prominent advisory board as well. Yeah. Within this project, we defined two key objectives. The one was before the project, actually. The one was the identification of current and future products, services, technologies in the field of virtual mobility with a potentially particularly large impact on physical traffic volume. Was the one. The other one was the quantification. It was the innovative, the rather innovative part of the project, the quantification of ecological and socio-economic effects of the identified product, services, technologies, taking into account, and this is a very important part also of our project, possible undesirable side effects, the so-called rebound effects. We started with a comprehensive research on present and future areas of application, and based on this research, we carried out 2 stakeholder workshops in Vienna in order to discuss all these options and to define those 3 areas where the greatest impact on physical traffic volume is expected. In fact, little surprising, it was on the one hand home office due to the large share of commuting in the total traffic volume. It was on the other hand the teleconferencing, particularly because it affects the especially environmentally harmful air traffic. And the third part was the online shopping due to constantly high growth rates in e-commerce. However, due to the time restrictions and the focus of this conference, I will now focus on the home office. If anyone is interested in the whole work, in the whole project, the end report is finished parallel to this session. Actually, it's finished in these days and it will be published within the next 2 weeks. If you're interested, just let me know and send me an email. In the next step, after the stakeholder workshops, we carried out a couple of qualitative surveys on different levels, expert interviews on expert level and population surveys as well. And the aim was to derive figures on the current and the future acceptance on the one hand and feasibility of these forms of virtual mobility on the other hand. With the exit restrictions due to COVID-19, virtual mobility gained an unimagined degree of importance, not only in Austria. And that's why we decided, actually, we had to decide to at least partially repeat all the qualitative surveys that we conducted in autumn 2019 in spring, exactly in April 2020. Coming to the quantitative work, I would like to start with a brief glimpse, very brief glimpse, in fact, on the method on the analysis of the potentials of home office. We conducted an analysis of the Austrian labor market, distributing the 4.24 million in employment in Austria to different forms of employment, to different economic sectors, branches, and so on. And we came to the conclusion that on short term, around 1/4 of all people in employment in Austria could potentially permanently work from home. And this number, this figure of 1/4, might increase to up to 40% as a result of changing work structures, changing work processes based on digitalization, automatization, connectivity, and so on. Yes, and with these figures, we recalculated the commuting trips in Austria for both scenarios, short and long term, with a 40% home office share. It means 2 working days out of a full-time working week of 5 days. This was one of the results of the qualitative survey. But this is approximately the number that people would, would accept as regards home office. More, if there are more days, it's more like 2 days, it's rather a social problem already, and a team building problem and so on. However, when conducting such research, it's particularly important to take possible rebound effects into consideration, which is not done in which wasn't done in various other projects that we found in, first of all, literature research. As regards home office, the following environmentally relevant rebound effects are conceivable or likely. On the one hand, we need to take into consideration that the energy consumption at home compared to the same activity in an office might increase due to a lower energy efficiency simply of based on building parameters, in fact, and that might cause a rebound effect on the energy use in buildings. However, which was more important for us were the rebound effects on the traffic volume, and there we need to mention the physical distance that might increase the physical distance between home and the place of work. For example, considering that you only have to go to work physically on, say, 2 days a week, there might be a higher acceptance of higher distances. And that means, again, a rebound effect as regards traffic volume. Another rebound effect is the induced traffic, which we see, which is actually empirically empirically proven already, and we see in all bigger infrastructure projects in mobility. If a new highway is built, for example, then this road side might face a lower traffic volume for a short time, but within 5 up to 10 years, both the roads will be full again. That means free capacities in cause-induced traffic. That's another rebound effect on volume, and of course, also obvious, the time gained from not having to travel to work might be reinvested in free time mobility. This is 3 possible rebound effects. On traffic volume, 2 of them were quantified within a research project from the University of Leuven in Belgium, and they came to the conclusion that only considering these 2 effects, there might be a rebound effect of up to 73%. This brings me to the result of home office. Due to the fostering, the strengthening, the intensifying of home office, there might be, we might reach short-term potential of up to 300 kilotons of CO2 equivalents that might be saved with 40% home office for around a quarter of the approximately 4 million people in employment, which corresponds to around 1.4% of the traffic-related greenhouse gas emissions in Austria. Taking into consideration the rebound effects, this number might reduce to up to 90 kilotons only. And this brings me to the summary of our project. On the one hand, virtual mobility is already, and we know that from online banking and everything that we are doing already, it's already replacing numerous physical routes and will change all areas of life in the years and decades to come. According to the experts, it's mainly home office, teleconferencing, and online shopping that might have the greatest effect on physical volume. Population surveys came to the result that also the population and all of the experts as well are see quite high potential in those aspects or these forms of virtual mobility. And by intensifying the aforementioned forms, it means teleconferencing, home office, and online shopping, up to 2.8% of all traffic-related greenhouse gases can be saved in short term. That means 2030. 2.8%, this is 630 kilotons of CO2. We have been faced with the argument a couple of times that actually this sounds to be very little number, but we made various reports already calculating singular measures, the potential of singular measures. And if you compare all the singular measures, this is actually in the upper third of all the measures, like 2.8% as the individual measure. Intensification of virtual mobility is more than it might sound on the first view. This 2.8%, 60% out of this number is home office that I was just explaining very briefly, and 20% each on the side of teleconferencing and home shopping. The third point about international traffic, I will skip now due to the time restrictions again. However, there are rebound effects that have to be taken seriously, and they might reduce the potential significantly. And that means that we need to take care, we need to tackle those rebound effects. And on my very last slide here, I would like to tell a few words about the meaning for the urban-rural nexus in the example of home office. We know that the commuter traffic from rural to urban areas and back is contributes significantly to the transport-related greenhouse emissions, not only in Austria. And virtual mobility has the potential to sustainably reduce the volume of commuting-related traffic, has the possibility to relax the tense traffic situation in the urban-rural area. However, this requires that the capacities that are freed up in this way need to be redistributed to public space in order to increase the quality of life in public space in order to avoid induced traffic, which means under the line simply we need to work on the rebound effects. We need to do something. We need to set measures that these rebound effects that I mentioned are not coming to ground. At the same time, through the increased home office, it's also a chance. It's a chance to upgrade the rural area as well, and to tackle the emigration from rural areas. in combination with an invigorating effect on regional trade and development of the city of short distances with small-scale structures that can be expected as well. So there is also a big chance in virtual mobility. There is a risk that is anyhow strengthened by the rebound effects that we need to take a very close look at and we need to think about, we need to work about, but there is also a big change, a big possibility to strengthen the rural area and also to increase the quality of life in the urban rural area, in the rural area particularly. Yes, that were my slides. Thank you very much. I think I'm quite good in time. Open for questions.
Yes, you are. And Holger, thank you very much for the presentation, which is of special interest for the project we are working on right now at the German Environment Agency. And I really welcome this exchange between the environment agencies all over Europe. Thank you very much for your presentation. Karl just mentioned we would like to switch with the questions to the presentation of Marianne. And then we will also look at the incoming questions regarding your presentation. Karl, please give the information.
Exactly, gladly. Yeah, the chats seem to come in a little bit later, so we'll go to the presentation Marianne really quick. There are two questions directed to your presentation. They're both in the same type of area. One question is, do you think that the EU should start investing more in a shift of the uses or economical activities in south of Spain or Portugal? So the areas that were heavily impacted by the maps that you said, that you showed, from less tourism to a more sustainable and green economy. If you could address that question, and also if you have any ideas about the impact of the pandemic on this topic as well.
Thank you very much. Those are questions I'd like to ponder more on than to answer right now. I mean, the EU has got a very big budget. Half the EU budget goes for agriculture, and there's a greening of the agriculture subsidies on the way. But I would argue that this could be much more focusing on increasing resilience in land use to take a long term rather than still having a predominantly production efficiency focus. So to focus on the long term and resilience. But with the Green Deal coming, there's it's a big focus of the European Commission to spend a lot of budgets on climate resilience, on transformation of our society into a sustainable, green and livable future. So, but the question is, how is that being taken up regionally? And there's a lot of power in this and ingrained path dependency. So it's difficult to change things rapidly. And the things with the pandemic has really shown us how little prepared Europe is and how much we really need to work much more together and learn from each other and have a concerted effort, because our worlds are interlinked. So yes, the pandemic has really opened the eyes also in the adaptation area of how much is still there to do when this happens at a much bigger scale than what we experience today. We still have a lot to do.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Karl, is there any information from the chat on the presentation of Holger? That's not the case right now. We are still waiting. Holger, I have a question regarding traffic rebound effects. When there is less commuter traffic between rural and urban areas, are you worried that there's also the danger that public infrastructure will be maybe reduced or something like this, and that could be induced that rural areas are less good connected to cities via public infrastructure, which would mean another rebound effect? Do you have any indications for that? What's your opinion?
Yeah, partially ironically, said, the infrastructure, it wouldn't be the worst for the infrastructure to be reduced as regards highways, for example. The rural areas and the urban areas are connected perfectly, at least in Austria, on the rail as well as on the road. The connection is very good. And this good infrastructure is used, which you see in traffic jams every day. I mean, I know this sounds like it doesn't fit, but we have 4 roads, 4 highway lanes going to Vienna from the south of Austria, for example. However, in Vienna, there's only 1 lane left, because it's a grown city, simply. There is not more space for more lines. It means it doesn't make sense to build even more lines and more lines. The connection between the rural and the urban area is good enough. In fact, it is too good because the result are traffic jams. In my opinion, the infrastructure could be reduced a little, of course, especially on the side of the motorized traffic, and maybe reinvested into rail infrastructure, of course, also so-called cycle highways. That means high quality infrastructure for cycle lanes. They need much less space also. So if you mean by public infrastructure, if you mean for example, the road infrastructure or the rail infrastructure, I wouldn't be worried that it might get worse because the infrastructure is set already. And if the little money that we have left, especially after the pandemic, is invested in rail, I don't see a problem, because in road it was invested for the last 40, 50 centuries already.
Yes, I totally agree with the streets and highways. I was rather concentrating on trains and rails, but really thank you very much. And the cycle highways is a very good keyword for our closing discussion, where we can talk about such new ways of infrastructure connecting rural and urban areas. I would like to hand over now to Daniel again, who is introducing the last speaker before the coffee break.
Yeah, thank you very much. So yes, I will introduce the next speaker. This is Mr. Lukas Hür from the University of Applied Science Osnabrück. Lucas has a bachelor in international business administration and a master in supply chain management, and he's currently working as a research associate and PhD student at the University of Osnabrück. And he focuses on product service system within the energy sector. And next to this topic, he's also working on a project called Logist Plus. And this is what he will show us now. So we are very interested. So the virtual stage is yours, Lucas.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. Yes, my name is Lukas Hür, and together with Professor Griese and Professor Franz from the University of Applied Sciences Osnabrück and the Osnabrück University, we reviewed research literature as well as examples from current industries in order to analyze potentials for optimizing the usage of logistical space. And I will start right away with the structure. So first of all, in my presentation, I will give a little introduction for the project Logist Plus. Then I will talk more about the work that I just introduced by firstly giving the motivation, then shortly introducing the methods. After that, I will discuss the results and conclude everything. So what is the project and why do we need it? The situation in the logistics sector is that there's more and more complex supply chains. And I think every one of you knows that the e-commerce, especially with the Corona situation, is booming in the last years. And due to this complex logistic processes, there's need for more logistical spaces. This is equally important for cities as well as rural areas. And through this need for space, there are a lot of land use conflicts as well as rising land prices. And there's also a conflict between the spatial requirements of companies and the sustainability goals that Mr. Reißmann already introduced in his presentation at the beginning. So we have the project Locust Plus. I won't talk much about it. I will show you a link at the end of my presentation so you can have more details by clicking on it. But our approach is to improve the land management of the companies in the region of Osnabrück as well as Steinfurt. And we are trying to implement innovative as well as cooperative approaches into those companies so that they have better ideas of how to efficiently use their space. For those things, we want to keep in mind not only the companies, but also the local residents as well as politicians, etc. So what is the work that we have done? First of all, the motivation behind it is that, as I said, those logistical processes are becoming more complex and the space is required even more in the last years. This often leads to excessive or harmful land use by the companies. And this in turn leads to negative consequences on the 3 pillars of sustainability. For one, there is the pillar of environmental sustainability. And more logistical space often means that the soil is getting sealed, which in turn decreases the biodiversity and the natural functions of the soil. And fertile areas are, for example, lost. Also, what I think is very interesting is that the microclimate can change since wind and temperature is affected differently by soils instead of natural areas. The second sustainability pillar that is affected by the land use is the social one. Especially for the logistics sector, it's mostly emissions and noise pollutions that arise from the increase in transportation and traffic. But also there's a loss of recreational landscapes, and there is a rising competition for space between companies and inhabitants. The third pillar is the economic sustainability, and this is mostly the increase in land price and land gets more scarce. So because of this problems, there is a need for more carefully using the limited resources, land and soil, and to optimize the land that is already there for companies in order to give future generations the same opportunities as we have today. Therefore, we decided the best way to do a first step is to analyze current best practices in order to show companies what kind of opportunities there are to improve their efficient land use. So which methods did we use to gain this relevant information? I will do this very shortly. It's Webster and Watson. They created a guideline on how to efficiently get all the data that you need from literature. And initially, we found more than 1,500 sources due to a keyword search, but then by deleting irrelevant data through categories such as quality or methodology, we in the end ended with 83 articles that are relevant for the search and that we then use to gain information on the field. So what are the results that we took out of those publications? First of all, it's important that there were 4 solution fields that became apparent. The first one is that through planning, the first and major step is done to efficiently use the land that a company has. After this, it's important to cooperate with partners externally or internally of the supply chain, or to digitize processes in order to even improve the planning process. As a 4th solution field, we found city logistics because this is a very hot topic, I would say, in existing literature. So now I will explain each of those 4 categories a little bit more. And let's start by land use planning. The planning, we defined it in our work as the best possible utilization and use of existing and planned logistics areas while keeping the 3 pillars of sustainability in mind that I explained earlier. On the right side, you can see popular logistic processes such as transportation or storage. And underneath those points, you can see examples for how to improve the land use for each of those processes. And I want to show you one very good example on how planning can increase the optimization of land use. This is a warehouse that you can see in the picture. And on the left side, you can see that that is where the products are stored. And the storage is not only horizontally across the floor, but it's also vertically in a high bay so that most of the space is used as efficient as possible. Another thing is on the right side, in front of the building, you can see several transport vehicles and the handling. So the step where the products are converted from the warehouse to the transport or vice versa is done here very efficiently, space saving, since the docks are shaped in a sawtooth kind of way. This just increases the usage of the space in front of the warehouse. Other things that can, for example, increase the usage of the space within a warehouse or within a production hall is the use of multi-conveyor belts, where, for example, products are getting sorted as well as transported at the same time. So those are just a few examples on how planning can help to optimize the use of logistical space. The second solution field is the cooperation inside the supply chain with suppliers, for example, or outside the supply chain with other companies you want to work with. So we defined supply chain management as something that aims to plan and control and optimize the flow of goods as well as informations, entire the whole value chain. Again, you can see some examples on the right side, but one example that is really important if you look across the whole supply chain is the bullwhip effect. I'm sorry that this is in German now, but I guess the meaning is still getting clear. The bullwhip effect is something that happens in a lot of supply chains because customers always have a demand of a product. And companies are trying to forecast this demand. And the further you go within the supply chain, the higher the forecast gets. So the supplier of raw resources or product parts is always forecasting more than he has to. So the amount of stock that he has stored of the product or of the resources is getting higher and higher the more you move up the supply chain. And this kind of problem you can prevent by communicating across the supply chain with your suppliers and buyers so that everyone gets the same information on the demand. This can increase the efficient storage of products and resources immensely. So this is just one example of how supply chain management and cooperation can improve the use of space. But there are also others like hub and spoke systems or warehouse shopping. But all those you can read in case you want to read the publication at some point. The third solution field is digitization, which we defined in our paper as something that generally refers to changes in processes, products, or objects that occur due to the increasing use of digital devices. I think everyone has heard of the word. One very good example here is cooperation of DHL with some suppliers in Singapore. They used a digital twin of a warehouse where they put sensors on all kinds of transport systems within the warehouse and also the products that are stored in order to completely create a digital twin. So just a digital picture of the warehouse that you can see on a computer, for example. And then you can optimize processes on the screen digitally and can see how you can save space in real life if you implement it. And this works very well for DHL and also for some other companies in order to save their space. Other examples for digitization improvements are mostly fleet management systems or things that go hand in hand with the Internet of Things or cyber physical systems. The last solution field is city logistics. This is a little bit different. We included it because it's a lot of researchers have this on their mind right now. So we are trying to find ways on how to improve the use of scarce land within cities. One example, which is very nice and that you can see in the picture, is the underground transportation of products and freight. But there's also different ways to handle this. For example, in Dresden, there is the tram that takes the freight from house to house, or there are cross docks that are in front of city centers or some kind of hub and spoke systems. All right, so let's go to the conclusion. As you saw within the various solution fields, there are many different ways on how to optimize the use of logistical space. And the first step should always be the planning phase, but this shouldn't be the last step. On top of the planning, there's always the opportunity to further increase the land use by efficiently cooperate with your supply chain partners or by implementing some technological or digitalized innovations into your processes. So there are multiple options to do this. Another thing that became apparent in the literature review is that especially in cities and dense populated metropolitan areas, those solutions are important because the space is just rare. So future research could look into this even more. And another thing the last thing that I want to say is that the work that we have done was mostly on the micro level. So we just looked at the companies, but future research could also look at the meso or macro level. So looking at how can politicians or local residents or even the national government increase the opportunities that those companies have. So maybe some people of you have already ideas on how to work there. So that was it. Thank you. And looking forward for questions.
Thank you very much, Lucas, for this very interesting presentation on logistics. Thanks. So, Carl, there's one question from the chat, you said?
Yes, correct. Thank you, Daniel. There is a question from the chat directly to you, Mr. Huber. Could you please list some of the problems you have encountered in this research that affects the delivery system directly? And the poser of the question is asking, can you please focus on the last mile or the inner city type of solution that you briefly presented? Thank you.
Okay, so sorry, I didn't understand. It's about problems for the delivery? Okay.
Correct, problems for the last mile.
Yeah, so last mile is especially important in city logistics because, it basically talks about the last few steps before something is delivered to a customer. And especially in cities, this is something that's getting more important, but also more complex because of just the sheer amount of product that is delivered every day. So companies often face problems by, especially the environmental aspect. They have to send multiple cars in the city and out the city. They need workers that drive the vehicles and that deliver the products. So I think one solution for this, or one solution that we found in the literature, is that those delivery companies are working together and sharing their transportation, because often, which is also another problem, those transportation vehicles are not fully loaded. But if they work together, they can load their transportation vehicle with products from other companies and then load their vehicle even more, and thus make it more efficient to drive into the city or out of the city.
So, thank you very much. I think there are not more questions, and we are also a little bit in time problem. So now we will go to our coffee break, and sorry, but we have to shorten it a little bit. Just 10 minutes now. We will go on with our session at 17:15 with two more interesting presentations, and after this we will have our closing discussion. But now we have this short bio break for 10 minutes, and so have a good break, and we will see us in 10 minutes. Thank you.